The biggest mistake the medtech companies does today, while they implement their QMS tool, they usually look for a product that is more of a heavy or fancy tool, while what they need is simple tool that is more traceable and that can actually fit their regulatory journey. But the challenge hit when they go for the audit and they fail in the audit because they fail to prove that what they have done is traceable. So I always recommend them start as early as possible. You do not need fancy systems. What you need is a simple automated system which can suffice your need, which actually can help you build your foundation. And once you build the foundation, it's easy to scale. What we always recommend, do not use the AI until you fully established, implemented your QMS.
We don't want to let AI take ownership over this process. We want to use it as a tool to assist and guide us throughout this process. And I think as long as we're doing that, it's an incredibly effective and incredibly powerful tool. Welcome back to the Med Device Cyber Podcast. I'm your host, Trevor Slattery. Unfortunately, our other co-host, Christian Espinoza, isn't able to make it today. He's currently flying back from Seoul after a whole gambit of travel delays. But we are joined here today by a very special guest, Dr. Basant, who's coming in from Dubai with Compliance Med QRA. I'd love to hear a little bit about yourself, some of your background, and what you're working on over there.
Hi, Trevor. Thank you. Thank you for having me. My name is Dr. Basant. I'm the CEO at Compliance Med QRA. We are located in Dubai. I have a background within medical devices and I have a PhD within neuromonitoring and neuroscience. We are a regulatory consulting company. We also have an automated quality management system. Well, within medtech industry, we believe that the QMS is not just a software, but it's a business system for survival. So having said that, in the current trend of medtech services or within ISO 13485, the tool that requires for quality management system is not just a tool. It requires for maintaining the traceability, to maintain the documentation, as well as the compliance, which is becoming day by day more and more challenging for the medical device companies. The biggest mistake the medtech companies does today, while they implement their QMS tool, they usually look for a product that is more of a heavy or fancy tool, while what they need is simple tool that is more traceable and that can actually fit their regulatory journey. And that's the challenge. What happens is normally when we communicate with multiple medtech founders or CEO at early stage, they always ask when they should implement a quality management system. And that's one of the challenges that many of the founders that come across at early stage when they are in the beginning. So what they have to do, what we advise them, that you need to start as early as possible, meaning that when they are at concept stage or at their R&D stage, they have to start there, because regardless, if they don't start, the design control already does start. So they have to document that, they have to do that in the version control manner, as well as traceable manner. So that is something challenging, especially among the startup and early stage companies. And many of the companies, for example, when they opt for a system, or some of them even go a shared drive or Google Drive when they use for implementing the quality management system. But the challenge hit when they go for the audit and they fail in the audit because they fail to prove that what they have done is traceable and there is a sufficient audit trail. The documentation is done correctly. The different processes has been implemented and those are traceable and documented and according to the different regulatory requirements. But some of the companies are still able to make it by doing Excel sheet and doing the documentation, manual work, by hiring multiple people. But that hits them hard when they scale, because when they have multiple products, when they have multiple processes, records, work instructions, that there it hits hard. So I always recommend them start as early as possible. You do not need fancy systems. What you need is a simple automated system which can suffice your need, which actually can help you build your foundation. And once you build the foundation, it's easy to scale. So from day one, if you're a startup, if you're looking for a complex quality management system, you might not have resource to implement it. and you might not able to actually accommodate all the processes and black box and processes that are already designed by these QMS providers. What we do as a company, as a solution provider here, we provide a customized tool, an AI integrated tool that design based on where the medtech companies are in their journey, for example, in their compliance journey, whether they're going for FDA, whether they're going for EU MDR, or they're looking initially to implement a QMS to get the QMS certification. It's the same hand to hand if you look with the cybersecurity, for example.
Right.
There are challenges if you look at cybersecurity. If there is no sufficient audit trail and then the test and penetration test, if you fail to document, if you have done sufficient cybersecurity testings, whether you go to any regulatory authority, you will be challenged. So I always recommend to start early, whether it's your regulatory journey, and if you are software as medical device, look for a capable cybersecurity expert who can actually ensure that what you're doing is correct, as well as look for a simple platform that can suffice the need to simply structure your QMS, ensure your traceability, and have you audit ready when you go for your first audit. Keep things simple. That's my mantra for medtech founders or early stage companies, as well as the companies that is willing to scale from startup.
Yeah, I think that's a great mantra to have. And even when you were saying, it's so important to start early, it was really resonating. I go, wow, this seems like a very parallel problem to cybersecurity. It's something where the downstream effects can be so severe if you're mismanaging your quality system or if you're mismanaging your cybersecurity. Obviously, cyber feels to be a subset of quality. I did once hear that cybersecurity is evidence of quality within your code, within your software. So I do think there's always an intrinsic tie-in between the two. So I know you've been talking a little bit about an automated QMS. For a bit of background, what does that mean? How are you integrating AI into your quality system solution? And what are you seeing as some of the real benefits that you have there, as opposed to a bit more of the manual SharePoint and Excel file approach?
I'm glad you asked. So what we do differently today from the conventional QMS or manual QMS, or some say paper-based quality management system. So we do have AI, which enables or help the regulatory or quality team to ensure they're more efficient. And how we do it, we have simple trained algorithm that simply draft the documentation, whether it's different processes, work instructions, or different requirement. It keep you in check with the various requirement, whether it's 821 CFR, there is EU MDR requirements, regulations, as well as different other regulatory requirement, including MDSAP. So what we do, we train our algorithm that keep the regulatory and compliance team in check. If something is non-compliant, it flags it. At the same time, what it does, it drafts the documentation based on your need, based on the data that you already have provided. And if you have not provided the data in the system, it can still suggest some of the documentation specific to your need. If you provide some of the information, what product class you have, the documents, what type of process that you're looking for. So if you provide a bit of information, it can draft, and then human in loop, meaning that your quality or regulatory expert can cross-examine, whether accept or reject or update. And we also ensure that the algorithm is sufficiently trained on the clinical evidence need by EU MDR or FDA requirement, so it can flag where you have gap. So the regulatory expert actually could fill the gap. So we are not replacing individuals or the expert, but giving them a tool to be more efficient.
Yeah, I was wondering while you were talking about it, where is this human in the loop intervention? I think that's something that is definitely a risk of AI, especially in such a tightly regulated space such as this, is the chance that an AI can run away and start presenting information that's not going to be accurate, or start presenting information that is going to be hard to trace back, or trying to essentially fabricate this full process. I always think of the example, if you go to ChatGPT and you tell it, do my taxes, make sure I get a $100,000 refund, it's going to go jump through whatever fake rabbit holes it can invent to get you that refund. Is it going to be legal? Probably not, but it's going to try. And so I think that's a really important thing to think about, is where is that interaction? And it sounds like you have a pretty good system. So the quality system and the AI within it is drafting the documentation, but you still do have a QARA professional who's able to go in, make sure that everything looks good there. One thing I'd be curious to hear about is if this is a situation that comes up when you're building out some of this content with AI generated information, we always think that the output's only going to be as good as the input. And so what do you typically see as some of the constraints if you're not giving it enough context to build this out? Is it going to try to just go across generally, or is it going to try to drill in for a bit more detail within the device specifically?
So what the option we have today, that we have trained algorithm and we also allow them to invent for you. So you have to choose and opt, and it comes with a warning. Like if you choose that it can invent and it can draft, then the user, for example, that your compliance team needs to look at it, validate the information, because yes, there it will be inventive, but then accepting them in your records or in your processes, it's completely up to the quality manager or the compliance person they have in the company. What it will not do if you keep on the conventional, a trained algorithm that is trained on your internal data. So what we always recommend, do not use the AI until you fully established, implemented your QMS. What does this mean by implementing your QMS is having your records and data that you already have, the basics, and it has a checklist that it says you have to have the product information, basic information. So it has already what it needs to provide you more accurate information. We have made the validation based on how much minimum data or information it needs in order to, for example, give you close to accurate output or close to accurate information. So we already have set the bars very high and we have trained the algorithm. So on that basis, what we do is we provide two options. Sometimes the user might get overwhelmed that it's very limited information. Then they can jump to another option that we have in our AI that can support to invent a bit and take the information or look at the information based on the LLM that we use. But if absolutely there, the compliance individual need to take responsibility. And we have a proper training to train the organization, and we made the validation accordingly. And we communicate that transparently to the user and the compliance team that how they should take this in terms of content. So we have the control there. I've been speaking to multiple regulators, authorities, for example, here in GCC, health authorities here, and they were really surprised because use of AI is a bit more flexible in terms of health authorities looking at in UAE. So I was talking with the regulators and they're like, oh, that's pretty good. I mean, I don't mind this way of accepting records and documents, even if human is not in loop. And I was surprised when I hear that. Of course, that's not something that they explicitly announce on the requirement or on the website, but I was surprised to hear that. I know that there will be constrained by the authorities and FDA if nobody look and someone, let's say, being carelessly document these documents and take in their QMS system or in their record. Of course, that could be disastrous for them, but the responsibility here must be taken by the user, which we try to communicate and provide this warning in the user guide and detail like, hey, you have to take responsibility, make sure what you're taking in, and make sure that you stay on your internal trained data output, because that will not go out, that will not invent something additional. It will just collect the information that it's fed on from your own record. It just frame it based on the requirement, and then it will flag the gap that you have. So you can go through it and just fill the gap that you have today based on the reference mentioned in EUMDR or FDA guidelines.
That makes sense. Yeah, that's really interesting to hear about the health authorities out there saying, even if we don't have the human in the loop, that is not the reaction you would ever expect. I do think
that was surprising for me.
Yeah. I think we're going to start seeing AI more on both sides of the fence, though. Even looking at, to pick the FDA for an example, that's what we're the most experienced with. That's what we deal with the most day to day. We're based in the US. It's going to make the most sense for us there. But of course, we interact with all of these different regulators. But one thing that we do notice with the FDA is just how bogged down they are with submissions. There are only so many people at the FDA. There are only so many people who can go through these reviews, who can go through these audits. And there are a lot more medical device companies out there. And so what I'm starting to see as a trend, and what I'm predicting we're going to see more and more, is that, the RAQA teams are using AI to help augment their capacity and help become more efficient. Like you said, we aren't trying to do this to replace an individual. We're trying to make that individual work better and work more effectively. But I think we're going to start to see more and more of this coming out through the regulators as well. I know a lot of the regulators have been piloting programs where they'll have a certain AI where they use for assistance with reviewing of documentation or reviewing of submission material. And so I think we're going to get to this AI arms race within the regulatory space where eventually AI is creating the evidence and AI is reviewing the evidence. And so I guess we'll see how things unfold, where the human in the loop is on each side. But yeah, it's interesting to hear. It sounds like the authorities in the UAE are a little bit more towards that direction. They're already gearing up for it.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's positive, and at certain extent for the compliance, it could be concerning because it must be taken care well. Because, I mean, if a medical device manufacturer use such tool, and if, for example, a validation record, for example, if a medical device or a pen test, for example, if it go and invent a pen test, for example, and there was no pen test has been done for SMD, that could be catastrophic. And if the authority accepts it as it is, then that will be challenging. So, of course, I'm 100% favor that there should be a proper scrutiny, human in loop, that is must. But coming back to what you said, I am seeing more and more notified body, certified body. Recently, when I had the communication, I'm seeing that they already implementing tools like which can actually look at your technical files, missions, and actually give you review. And when those review is compiled, then human in loop going there and cross-validating if what has been found as a gap is actually a gap. That reduces a lot of effort from the certified body as well, including FDA. So I haven't seen that FDA is adapting this now. I'm sure they're going to go eventually that path. But in Europe, multiple certified body, notified body already started working to adopt such tool to provide more and more efficiency to their team, because the review will take weeks and months to provide feedback. And what it takes some time, or a standard time, it takes almost a year if you have a software as medical device class 2A or B. It takes almost a year, from 9 months to 12 months cycle, to have 3 into 3 cycle, for example, for the review. So this tools like this can actually reduce those review cycles and time. But of course, with a human in loop and someone taking responsibility that things has been done correctly. That's my take. As I said, it should not replace human, but it should be acting as a tool or more efficient tool to make human more efficient, right?
Completely agree. Yeah, and where I think we'll start to see problems come up with this is when we're trying to look for the traceability. And that's always where AI has a little bit of a struggle. It can, of course, generate the process. We can generate the artifacts, or we can generate the process to try to support this submission. But generating the artifacts that are showcasing our compliance and that we're showcasing we're doing what we say we're doing, that's where I think there's going to be a little bit of difficulty. So I love the example about AI hallucinating a penetration test. That's completely something I could even imagine happening. And then we have this artificial document. And, who's to say where that chain of custody stops? We need to actually verify whether or not this happened. I think that it's something, as we start to see it be used more and more, we're going to start seeing that more human in the loop part around the traceability, around the evidence of compliance. Since that's, like I said, that's where I think that disconnect is going to start happening. But I think overall that, it's a clear direction where we're going. It's interesting that some of these notified bodies and certified bodies in the EU are getting a little bit quicker with this. Oftentimes, we always see that the US seems to be the Wild West with new technology and regulation. It's let things go wild until something goes wrong and then try to pull back the reins a little bit. We've often seen the inverse is true in Europe. So it seems like the tables are a little bit flipped for this specific point.
Yeah, for the moment, I see it's coming. I'm sure that FDA probably using at a certain level, having human in loop, but I haven't had a chance to speak about it to an FDA authority, whether they're using a tool or not. Coming back to the point about the traceability, I fully agree. And this is the reason that we do not use AI in our tool for the traceability, that we keep fully manual. So regardless, we use provide in different modules that we have, but the traceability must be handled manually. That's how we approach to it to avoid the concern that you raise. So yes, I agree on that part. And I believe that it will open more and more, but there will be challenges. I'm sure when we start using crazily, I think there should be, as you noticed, that using AI in the medical device is already coming different requirements, regulations. In Europe already there is EU AI Act that has to be fulfilled. So similarly, there will be different regulations by different authorities for use of AI, and I'm actually pretty open and looking forward to it. And looking at different for software as medical device, and looking at a new standard came in from FDA, whether it's not in force yet, but still I see that a lot of work has been done. And initially, if you look at the history of medical devices, I mean, originally all the regulations were made considering the medical device. All the software as medical device standalone were evolved and based on the regulation were made for software meant for the devices as medical device. So for many years, software as medical device struggled to have its own independent requirements and regulation. And there were many things that doesn't make sense. I think this is where we are at the moment with the AI from the regulators. And I'm sure that that's going to come down to different requirements that how filter out and how we regulate the use of AI. I think that's a must from the authorities. Otherwise, it'll be too late and there'll be a lot of mess. And we don't want to play with human lives when we talk about the medical devices.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the hard parts about being in the medical space. Obviously, the genie's out of the bottle. AI is here to stay. AI is taking over just about every industry you could imagine. But seeing how it is applied in the healthcare space is especially dangerous since, we are playing with human lives at that point. If we're trying risky implementations of new technology, we need to be sure that it's validated against proven practices. We're actually understanding what we're putting into this and what we're getting out. It always seems like a silly example, but trying to break prompts on ChatGPT and see what weird output you can get from it. It's a fun, harmless way to test how AI can fail or can succeed in certain constraints. But then applying that to a medical use case, the consequences are so much severe. I do think that luckily, the industry is going in a pretty healthy direction. It seems to be treading the water lightly. We aren't trying to have, AI fully autonomous surgical robots yet, but we're still getting in a good direction, seeing how it's applied with proper use cases in imaging, for an example, seeing how we're able to use it for clinical decision support systems in a really effective fashion. And I think then going back to some of that compliance and tying it into how you're preparing these technical files for the notified body, preparing these submission and evidence artifact files for regulatory purposes. I think that's another awesome point there. It's good to know that traceability is still a manual human in the loop connection, since that I could definitely see being a little bit of a constraint there. But one thing I do want to go back to, and you mentioned this earlier, is you're recommending that anyone get started on their quality system and their quality practices as early as possible. What are some of the consequences that you can see when you aren't implementing this early enough? And what are some of the warning signs that a medical device manufacturer should look out to say, hey, we might be going off a cliff here. We need to be sure that we're getting on top of our quality system.
Yeah. So what happens early when a startup starts? Of course, they are limited on their funds, but what they start doing is finding a platform, some of them which is using, for example, Confluence, some of them are using Share Drive, Google Drive. But when things start hitting, when they have to, for example, approve and have the traceability, and then maintain the documentation and do the effective version controlling, change controlling, revision and review and approval, and all these areas, then they get challenged. So what happens that, and many of them, they overestimate, they think, okay, that is what they have done manually by using these different platforms is sufficient. What happens, they don't even realize, and their development team start moving because the product development is on the way. Once they over the R&D, the product development on the way. And they think like, say, I'm writing a test case, I'm writing a verification output, saving them in a sheet. That's not sufficient. Many of them do not even realize, and they're ready to make the submission. And I work with many, and the consequence they have to face then, they have to have an efficient team of compliance, or they will have expensive consultants. And what they will do is they come back and reverse document everything. That will take months. So what happens? They lose the time. There might be, these individuals might not be involved when the actual development happened. So they might not trace fully, and fully might not reverse document everything that has been done, for example. So there are possibility that they miss one or two, for example, device specification, a product specification, and or miss to establish a traceability from device specification till the risk, or risk mitigation by the design, by implementing various design, risk mitigation by the design, for example. That could cost them when they file for submission. That would be a mess. If for example, a device manufacturer or company, they give them a contract or a limited time or just a project. So they just need to finish that project. So what happens that then they do not focus to implement everything. They just focus to bring them to the certification. So there are different challenges. For example, one, they have to double the work or redo everything, so that will cost them time, and they have to wait some time for almost a year to reverse implement with the high risk class device. For example, they have spent years to do the clinical validation, clinical design verification, testing, test cases. They have to redo if they cannot document it. If they haven't documented it, everything is lost and they have to redo it. So redoing that, redocumenting it, then going for the regulatory submission. So that's one big gap: time, cost. And the second concern, for example, some of them, they have done minimal documentation in their share drive, and they pass the audit or they get over the certification. But what happens when they start scaling? Then everything is a mess. And then they have 40 people, 50 people in the system, and nobody knows how everything works. So you can build, for example, amazing standard operating procedure, but if it hasn't been followed, that's equal to nothing, because your process and your evidence that you have doesn't relate. So again, it's a mess. Your product is already certified. You might have the next audit and you fail the audit, you might lose the certificate. So the risk is higher if your product already in the market. So the best way is to start as early as possible because of these reasons. Of course, the cost, the time, as well as later fall when some of the startup companies that I met a talk, when they come to us when they're scaling and say, like, we don't know what to do. We are 60 people or 70 people in the company. We had a SharePoint or we had a drive that we use. Now we have challenge scaling it. Then they spend actually 6 months to 8 months just to transition from one to another. And that's another big challenge because they have to pause ongoing other development. They have to pause new certification. So to avoid all of these, the best is to start early. And again, as I mentioned in the beginning, not to think about a very complex system if a company startup and you are in the early stage, but to build the foundation in a system that you can build on and later that is scalable. That is something very important that many of the medtech manufacturers miss out. Either they too early go towards very heavy system and they have very limited resource to implement actually and to follow as the system is designed. Oftentimes, they buy too light system or no system when that gives them challenge when they scale. So the right balance is to start early with a simple system, build the foundation, and scale as you grow.
Yeah, it's a hard problem being a medical startup. There's so much that you need to cover. And I think you touched up on kind of the biggest problem. There's only so much money to do it. You need to figure out who's going to build the product. Are we hiring in-house software engineers? Who's handling our quality? What do we need to spend on tooling? What do we need to spend on our clinical studies? Oh, wait, we forgot about regulatory in this full process. And I think that's something that we also see in the cybersecurity space is we've gone through all of these activities. We have this great product. We're getting ready for our submission. And then they bring in a regulatory consultant to make sure that they have everything ready for their submission. Great, you've got your software. Great, you've got your biocompatibility. You got your usability. You have your clinical studies. Where's your cybersecurity? And they go, cybersecurity? What do you mean, where's our cybersecurity? We need cybersecurity? And it's a similar effort. We have to go back and try to retrofit cybersecurity into an existing product. It's kind of this bolt-on approach instead of the secure by design. We're starting with cybersecurity in mind. As soon as you have this idea for the product, trying to scale it up into a truly safe and secure device. Oftentimes, we see the same types of timelines. It can be 6 months, 12 months of trying to go back and try to retrofit all of this design. A big problem that comes up here, especially, is when we're making all of these changes to the product, sometimes you need to fundamentally change how the product works to make sure that it works securely. If you've already done all of your validation under this design and you need to go back and make a bunch of changes to a new design and upversion everything, all of this validation work needs to be done over in its entirety. And so this is really where we're starting to see a lot of medtech innovators and medtech manufacturers have these delays imposed in their system. It is a really hard problem. There are so many different things to solve. I feel like we have a little bit of a biased view into it since we're each only dealing with one side of the house. We just look at cybersecurity. You're looking at regulatory, but going into all of these other activities, reimbursement, commercialization, making sure that you're developing the product, raising all of your funds. There are so many different problems. It's hard to be a medtech innovator out there.
Absolutely. And I think it's getting more and more challenging because the new requirements coming and more competitors are there. So being in the medtech, if I think from a medtech manufacturer perspective, it's really tough. spot to be in. But I mean, there is room for, there's a big room, not only room, but there's a big room for those medtech innovators to grow and place their product in the market and make a strong market business. And coming back to your point, I have seen in my own experience within the regulatory consulting, the submission got rejected, got failed because of non taken care well of cybersecurity part. And I have learned hard way, if you ask me personally, because we are not cybersecurity, for example, the core cybersecurity experts. So in that way, in early stage, we have seen the challenges that how not well taken care cybersecurity part with your product development. When I talk about software as medical device, if all the tests, including the pen test, has not been done correctly for the cybersecurity part, the FDA is very hard on it, and they're getting harder and harder on that part. So I fully agree and align with you on that. Of course, oftentimes the medtech innovator miss on that, but the people like you, people like us should actually inform, educate. I think the best way is to educate and bring the awareness. And of course, using platform like this that we are speaking here and different other activities that you're already doing in your organization. I think that is something that what we can do. And you guys are doing pretty well to bring that awareness, presenting or bringing that on the table that yes, have that attention before you go to FDA. Look at your cybersecurity. And I'm telling you from my experience, but I'm sure that you had multiple cases that you have harder pushback from FDA because of their cybersecurity compliance pushback from FDA.
Yeah, it's unfortunately all too common. And exactly like you said, awareness is really the best thing that we can do about it. If a medtech innovator, I know we're talking about all these problems, but I don't want it to sound like this is an impossible task to do. And if people didn't want to try to solve these problems, we wouldn't have so many of the incredible medical innovations that we see come across the door every day. That's honestly the best part about this job, is seeing what amazing technologies people are making and what incredible problems people are solving. But I think just once you identify, there's a problem, someone's got to solve it. I want to be that someone. Just understanding, what does that journey look like? And what does that path look like? What are the different areas you have to go through? It shouldn't be a black box where you just say, well, I want to make a medical device, but hopefully we'll see if this goes well. I think the more information you can have and the more transparency that we as the medtech community can provide, it's going to make it as easier. We're going to see a lot more success stories if we're clear about what the expectations are and what people need to do there. So, and I think we're going in the right direction. We're seeing a lot more awareness coming up about some of these problems. Cybersecurity specifically, we're seeing a lot of companies coming in earlier saying, hey, we recognize this is a problem and we want to work with someone to help us design this a bit more safely and effectively. So I think that we're going in a good trajectory there for sure.
Absolutely.
Well, I know we've had a great conversation and we're coming up on time here. Typically Christian's the one to do this, but since he's not here, I'll have to fill his shoes instead. So we like to go around the room and collect some last minute insights. What are your key takeaways from this? And so I'll go ahead and start. If you were to sum this up and say, what do you want anyone listening to take away from this conversation? What would that be?
I think that the takeaways that I see, we have touched upon a few topics, but I think the key takeaways for our audience, if we talk about what the medtech innovators startup should do for early on in terms of their compliance as well as their quality management system implementation. So I think this part is key for them to take into consideration what they must do before they hit the design and development, or they think about their compliance journey to get the registration, get their QMS certified. So that's one part of the takeaway. And if I look at the second aspect we talk about is how the AI can change the compliance journey of a medtech innovator, and how AI in their quality management system can enable their team to be more efficient compared to conventional method. At the same time, how important it is to early think about the cybersecurity part. If a medtech innovator going towards EU MDR or US FDA or any other global regulation, registration, certification, the cybersecurity is the key. So I think early going for the quality management system implementation, using the right way of AI, as well as considering early the cybersecurity journey before it's too late or it become too costly. I think these are the three key takeaway from my perspective. What do you think, Trevor?
Yeah, I think you touched up on all the right points there. I want to drill in a little bit more onto the AI points, since, of course, in the security space, paranoia is what we do. But making sure that you're using this safely and effectively. accountability. Having the human in the loop, can't let an AI run wild and try to take control over this process. Going back to the famous quote, a computer can never be responsible for making a computer can never be held accountable. Great. Now I forget, possibly Silicon Valley's most famous quote. But the point being, we don't want to let AI take ownership over this process. We want to use it as a tool to assist and guide us throughout this process. And I think as long as we're doing that, it's an incredibly effective and incredibly powerful tool. And it's something that we're going to see, RAQA professionals, cybersecurity professionals, software engineers, everyone being more effective and useful with their tasks. But I think we just need to understand there still needs to be that human in the loop. It can't be held accountable. And so we have to be the ones to be held accountable in its place.
Absolutely. Fully agree with that.
Awesome. Well, this has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you all for tuning in to the Med Device Cyber Podcast, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you, Trevor.